Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is a game from the 1981 USSR Championship between Vitaly Tseshkovsky, who's playing the white side, versus Garry Kasparov. We have the game opening up with 1e4, Kasparov replying with the Sicilian. We enter now an open Sicilian with d4, and now the Taimana variation with knight c6, knight c3. Black has this small pawn center, and whether you're playing as black or white, this is the one advance you need to be aware of, the liberating d5 advance. You'll even see it without this pawn on e6 lending support to that square. Sometimes if this pawn is on e5, it's the d5 advance black would still like to try and get in. So that's the pawn break to be aware of for sure. White goes forward with a kingside fianchetto, more development on both sides. And now a4 clamping down on this a6 b5 idea, expanding on the queen side. Black castles, and now this knight is looking to reroute to potentially the g3 square. This is the idea that we will see take shape, h3 and g4, and the knight could maybe be pivoting on this g3 point. Additionally, as we'll soon see, this c3 advance is played, and this could make life a bit more difficult for, let's say, black to put pressure on the queenside pawn structure. So rook c8, half open file, c3 is played. It also reinforces the knight. If there is a capture, white is in a position to recapture with the pawn. One other thing to note is that white can sometimes play this knight b3 move, trying to show that, okay, white has a space advantage and is not so quick to allow for exchanges. So knight b3 would be avoiding a potential knight exchange. Another way to look at it is that the queen would have a direct influence on the d5 square, making d5 more difficult to get in. But we don't have that. Instead, it's knight c to e2, rook c8, c3, a6. Looking to secure the queen's post on c7, rules out knight b5 stuff. And here we go now with h3 and a g4 expansion. This, one might even reason, is a multi-purpose move, since the king will often like to have an additional square to run to. Queen c7, and now g4. It's at this point that black needs to take action right away in the center with d5, and that's exactly what we have. Trying to first, let's say, bring another piece into play, it's not working. It's not in time because g5 happens. This knight has to go to a not so great square. So now is the time for d5, and you can see that by this threat right here of g5. You can also run forward with it if you're familiar with the idea of attacking or breaking in the center if your opponent is trying to attack you on the wings, which is what we have right here. White is looking to press forward, expand on the king side, so you can meet that with an action in the center. And even if in some cases this d5 move is played at the cost of a pawn, notice that the energy that's built up behind it, these bishops in particular, diagonals will be opened up for them, and they will spring to life. And as it stands right now, if the position does open up, who will be the side who does better? It will most likely be black, since they are fully developed. White still needs a couple moves before they are in a similar position. So d5 is the break. We do have that capture. The knight recaptures, and white parts with their light square bishop. And this is always a little bit of a scary thing to do. He is the most important minor piece for white. If you're going to have a kingside fianchettoed bishop and you're going to give him up for a knight, there's going to maybe be some issues on these light squares, h3, f3 in particular, and maybe one day the h1 square is, let's say, more accessible should there be a queen bishop diagonal on, or a queen bishop battery along that diagonal. So it is bishop takes knight, the pawn recaptures, and with the follow-up knight f4, white looks to grab this pawn, and this knight could be quite annoying to the black side. So it's quite interesting to see how exactly Kasparov handles this. It starts off with first a repositioning of this dark square bishop, And what better diagonal than this one here, pointing right at the king. Actually, that's a terrible diagonal. This diagonal right here. Knight takes would be met with queen to e5, and this queen is very strongly placed, hitting at both knights. This knight is hit for a third time, and if he goes somewhere else other than, let's say, e2, there could be queen to g3, let's say, a counterattacking move here. Keep in mind, this f2 pawn is pinned, so she can pivot on g3, and bad news for white. So knight e2 is a possibility, but after something like bishop e6, yes, black is still down a pawn, but notice all the activity that they have, the weaknesses in the white position, the lack of development on the white side. These are all factors. These are all ways to show compensation for the pawn. We don't have that, though. It is not the knight immediately recapturing on d5. Instead, it's knight b3. The knight gets out of the way of the bishop, attacking it on c5, and it drops back to a7. One thing that I questioned was why not, let's say, go to b6. And the reason for that is because the bishop also has thoughts of maybe going to that b8 square and looking for mate on h2 or something against that king on that square. So queen now takes. Keep in mind the knight still can't take. Queen g3 would follow. So it's queen takes. And now bishop e6, giving yet another pawn, potentially. And it's something that, well, white has to go in for it. Otherwise you're dropping b3. So it's knight takes bishop, pawn takes knight, and we don't have the queen taking the pawn. It's queen e4 instead. What would happen if queen takes pawn? Well, it's interesting to note that this position is so strong for black, they could just tuck their king away in the corner, and serious threats here. What do you do about queen g3? What do you do about potentially this knight getting to a dream square in f3? Both rooks for black are already working. The white rooks not having a great day. The knight, terrible. He's canceled out by the bishop, and we could even add more to it. This bishop rules out this knight doing anything exciting and is still contributing, pointing right at the king. f2, pawn is pinned, the king is in the line of fire. Certainly compensation in this position. The only piece that's active for white is the queen, but you can, in short order, see a rook playing to e8 to put pressure on the queen. Just showing one variation of how bad this can turn out. We could have bishop to e3, trying to alleviate the pressure along this diagonal, but after bishop to b8, now comes threats of getting to h2, and if you're stopping it with f4, rook on c to e8, this bishop is going to be dead. So it would be a very difficult position for white, losing position for sure, if this pawn is captured. Instead, it's queen e4, and now rook takes on f2. I'm not sure what else there is besides queen to e4. If you come back to g2, again, this knight's dream square is f3, and it's just a hop and a skip away from becoming a reality. e5, f3, it's a tough situation for white, no doubt. Again, this rook not contributing, this bishop. Everything points to the underdevelopment of the white side, especially in an open position such as this one here. So it's queen e4 instead. Rook takes on f2. This combination puts white in some serious hot water. Rook recaptures. We do not immediately recapture, but instead look to exploit the pin, piling up on f2. The queen comes back to defend. Bishop takes rook. King to f1 is the move that was played in the game. If king to h1, there would be queen d3, and if this bishop is captured at this point, this queen will be lost after something like rook to f8. And if the queen is playing here, we would have this check. If the king moves, it's actually going to lead to mate with queen to d6. There has to be these sorts of moves to block. Something like queen g3, there's this rook check and the queen is dead. Mate happening very soon. So that's one of the reasons why we would not have queen takes bishop in this position. And what more would there be? because we also have this threat here. If, let's say, bishop g5, rook f8, just making a move, rook f1, this is yet another serious threat. Pivoting on f3 and looking to crash through on h3, this queen will yet again be lost. If this, we have check, and then the pin of the queen. Black is winning. But we don't have that. We don't have the king running in the corner at this stage here after bishop takes rook. Instead, it is king f1, and what now follows is a centralization of the queen. A very strong post for a queen, especially when the position is very simplified. She really gets to show her full strength in one of these 4 center squares when there's few pieces remaining on the board, and on top of it when there is an exposed white king. Bishop f4 is what was played. If we do have this, it's going to be the pin and the win of the queen. If we have king takes, similar to the variation I showed previously, we would have something like this. The queen would be won in this position as well. So we don't have the bishop being captured at this point, but instead bishop f4. Queen takes bishop is simple enough because after the recapture on f2, this knight, I was talking about him being a terrible piece earlier because of the bishop. When it was on a7, it was canceling the knight out and still contributing by putting pressure on these king side squares, f2 and g1. The additional downside of this knight is now highlighted after queen c4. It is unprotected, and at this point, white has to just resign. They are losing the knight on b3. So that's all for this video. As always, I hope you got something out of it. Take care. Bye.